everyone. I am continuing the review videos, and one of the things that was asked by several people was to go over some of the biochemistry. And so I thought I would definitely take care of that for you. So things to keep in mind when we're thinking about biochemistry is going to be the chart, right? There was a reason that I made you learn it when you were freshmen, and AP is no different. The chart is very, very helpful. But I've deconstructed it a little bit to go into a little bit more depth and to kind of help you frame that knowledge in a slightly different way, and I'm hoping that maybe this helps. So we're still going to be talking about monomers and polymers. We're still going to be talking about structures and functions, but we're going to go into it in a little bit more detail, and hopefully this will help quite a bit. So let me see if I move that just a little bit closer. Okay, I think that's going to be as good as it gets for right now. So we're going to start with the first one, which is carbs, and I know it's difficult to see in the video, but this is green, of course, because we do carbs in green. Plants make carbs and they're green, so that's kind of what we're looking at. So when we're thinking about carbohydrates, it's really helpful to break down the name. So the carbo in the front means carbon, and then the hydrates in the back is referring, of course, to water. So when we're thinking about carbohydrates, first off, plants require carbon and water to make them, and so they produce this combination of things as a result. But also it reminds us the fact that this is going to be found in multiples. So you'll have one carbon to every water molecule, or CH2O, or a 1-to-1 ratio, however it helps you to remember it. And it's not necessarily precisely that, but it's going to be real, real close. Their monomers are called monosaccharides. Mono, of course, meaning one, and saccharide meaning sweet or sugar. And the monosaccharides are normally drawn in what the chemists call ring structure, although it really doesn't look like a ring, they're just connected. So some examples would be things like glucose and sucrose, and then those would be the 6-carbon sugars, and then 5-carbon sugars would be things like deoxyribose and ribose. And then remember, of course, that ose is referring to carbohydrates. Through the process of polymerization, and we're going to go into that a little bit more in a few minutes, we can get the polymer. And the polymer in this case is a polysaccharide, which of course means many sweet or many sugars. So basically we're going to see these, the monosaccharides connected with bonds to form various structures. The way that they are formed determines their function, of course, because we keep talking about form and function. And what that means is some bodies, like human bodies, can break down certain types of polysaccharides, but not others. So, for example, when we're thinking of polysaccharides, you need to be thinking of stuff like starch, which is a complex sugar, right? You get it from eating potatoes and things like root vegetables. So when we eat starch, our body has the enzymes to break it down so that we can get glucose from it to do cell respiration. But things like cellulose, which is in part of the structure of plant cell walls, it's the major component of plant cell walls. So when we're thinking about that, our bodies can't break that down. So because we have stuff like that we just cannot break down, but other organisms have the enzymes to do that. And so, we'll get into that more later, but that can cause some different things to occur in the organism. There's some mutualistic relationships to kind of offset that in the world. But cellulose would be an important one to remember. And another one that we've talked about since freshman year is chitin, which is looks like chitin, but we pronounce it chitin, and that is in the cell walls of fungi. Function. Remember back when you were freshmen, we talked about that TEXs, you only had to know that this was short-term energy, but they have other roles. And one of the most important roles is structural. So when we're talking about cell walls, and starch, things like that, especially stuff like cell wall construction. We're thinking about structure, and the fact that they offer a lot of structure to organisms. The second thing, when we're talking about the chart, is the lipid. Now, normally lipids are in yellow, but it's really hard to read on a poster, so I did it in orange for you just to make it yellow-ish, and I didn't have a brown, which is what I normally use in class when we're doing lipids like this. So remembering things like the lipids have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, not in any particular order, but mostly carbons and hydrogens, very little on the oxygen side. The monomers, and we put that in quotes because it's not exactly the term, it's kind of a generalized term that we would use, but the biochemists wouldn't actually call them monomers. So just be aware of that. However, if you do on the AP test, it's not something that's going to get you. Glycerol is one of the common, like, simple building blocks to make the more complex ones. And it normally involves a 3-carbon chain with an OH group. And then we have fatty acid chains, which are primarily just carbon and hydrogen, and they do have an oxygen in there as well. The polymers for the lipids, generically we call them fats, oil, and waxes, and as we talked about in class, that is going to be based on the structure, the number of saturated bonds, and it's also going to determine the consistency of this lipid at room temperature. So some of these are going to be liquid, some of these are going to be sort of liquidy, squishy, and some of them are going to be pretty darn solid. So based on that, they would be your fats, oils, or waxes. Some examples of these that you should really know, triglyceride, that's just a great one for humans in general. That's actually, it would be where you have a glycerol and 3 fatty acid chains attached to it. That would be a triglyceride. And something like that is going to affect your, potentially affect your body's ability to have blood flow through capillaries. So if your triglycerides are too high, then it can cause some issues with blood flow, and we start talking about atherosclerosis and some things like that. Another one I think is incredibly important would be phospholipids, right? So you've got the 2 fatty acid chains, and then you've got the phosphate group on top, and that is one of the major constructs of the cell membrane, and so really important for survival and the ability of cells to function. Other things to be aware of are things like hormones, specifically steroid hormones, and those are steroids and hormones, or steroid hormones, are going to be some pretty important lipids. So things like, testosterone, estrogen, things like that are very, very similar to cholesterol, which is a steroid. And so things to be aware of, right? And so when we're talking about function, of course, the first one is going to be the long-term energy storage. We've talked about that. That's what Texas wants you to know. But beyond that, I like to group the next major function and just call it protection. And that could be anything from the cell membrane, that phospholipid protecting the cell by being picky about what can come in or out, right? That's a form of protection. It could cover things like wax. So the wax on the outside of plants prevents water loss, protecting the plant. The wax in your ears is going to protect your eardrum from foreign bodies coming in, protection. Sweat is going to release certain chemicals from your body that aren't necessary at the time, and they're going to help you regulate body temperature, protection. Organisms that live in the far north and have a little blubber layer to keep them warm, that's for protection against cold. And so lots of things like that, just to kind of group them in a very general concept, would be protection. And that, of course, is a pretty important thing as well. The third one on the chart would be proteins. And so when we're talking about proteins, this is one where it seems pretty simple and then it really isn't, right? And we start talking about all of the fancy types and the stages, and we'll get there. But let's just go over the basics first, okay? So proteins are going to have CHO and N, so they'll introduce nitrogen. Some of them have sulfur, not all of them do, but some do. The monomers are going to be amino acids. And as we mentioned in class, your amino acids, there are 20 of them found in /on the world. Some your body can make, some it can't. So that's why we have to ingest amino acids, and we need them just to be able to start as building blocks to start making other things. The amino acids have a variety of different characteristics. Some are polar, others are nonpolar. Some are acidic and others are basic. Some are charged. So all of those things is going to affect how they interact with each other and with the environment. Just to be aware of. You don't have to memorize which one is which, at least not until you get into some pretty advanced biochemistry and or medical school. But it is good to know that these things occur, so when we start thinking about how the big protein structures actually form and how they function differently from one protein to another, it's because of the components of the amino acids. So when we're looking at the polymers, most people just call them proteins or polypeptides. Remember that the bond between the two little amino acids, or each of the amino acids, is called a peptide bond. So it's a polypeptide. A specific example of that would be an enzyme, and we'll talk more about enzymes in a different video. And of course there are lots of others, but we would group them generally in this category. One of the things that it's very, very important to remember is that in this case the order of the monomers matters to the polymer, because the amino acids are different from each other, significantly different from each other. If you have the same amino acids but in a different order, it's not going to make the same protein. So this has the same number and types of amino acids as this one, but they're in different orders and they're going to fold differently. And the way that they are shaped helps determine their function. So remember that the order of the amino acids is significant and matters. When we're talking about the functions of proteins, this is where I told you back when you were freshmen, if you could not figure out which biomolecule was doing the job, it was probably a protein. And that is because proteins do almost everything in the body besides basic energy, although you can eat protein to eventually be transformed into sugars for energy, but it takes a while, so it's not good for immediate energy. And things like genetics, right? Although they do have some control over it, so at least there's that. So some of the functions that these have would be enzymatic, so they can be enzymes, which are biological catalysts. They can control cell transport, so the things that just can't naturally get through the phospholipid bilayer get through the proteins. Movement in general, so things like myosin and actin are going to work together to allow the cells to stretch, like muscle cells. This is what we would find inside flagella or cilia to help the cells move. So a lot of the movement of the body or movement of small organisms is due to proteins. Structure, hair, nails, a lot of stuff in the skin is based on protein. Some of the structures in the bones are based on protein that then get filled in with other things like calcium and other materials. So these are going to have some very significant structures and components of like individual cells, but also organs and systems. Hormones is another one for this. And of course, we've talked about how important hormones are as far as like control over a body. So some hormones are lipid based and the rest of them are protein based. And that's going to have a major function. One of those functions being stuff like self-signaling. So the hormones go into the bloodstream, and then based on the individual cell receptors, they will go to certain cells and be ignored by others, and then that hormone will tell that cell essentially what to do next. And then the last one I have up here is epigenetic control. And so when we really start thinking about how these cells are specialized and how we can have gene regulation within cells that are controlled by aspects of the environment, remember that even though proteins are coded for by amino acids, certain proteins control which of the amino acids get copied, or which of the nucleic acids get copied, and therefore which proteins get made. So it is kind of a give and take, and they do have control over that. This list is not exhaustive. There are a lot of other things that proteins do, but this is just kind of a get your toes wet reminder of some of the things that proteins can do. So we will continue the rest of this in another video just to keep it a little bit shorter. As you're preparing yourself for the AP exam, just know that I have every confidence in your ability. I know you're going to do great. I'm so proud of all of the work that you've done so far. And I'm here rooting for each and every one of you. Mwah. Be well.